Hey, sorry, my computer had a spasm, but we're all good. No cigar this time.
No, I'm not gonna smoke it inside. I don't want to ruin the ceilings in my house. Um, so, how are you?
I'm doing good, man. I'm pumped for this episode. I know we're going hard. You just declared war on the internet
Yeah, I
yesterday.
did. Yeah, we'll see what happens. Um, the episode we have today is ancient India, and this is the kind of thing where, as the history podcast, I sometimes go for topics that I know that the audience really obsesses over. That being like the U.S. Civil War, the World Wars, and then there are other topics in which I know about, and I don't know anyone else who has a public platform who does know about them. And I see it as a duty to cover those topics. Um, because one of the hobbies I have is I go into certain eras of history that try to explain how the world today operates and that the rest of society doesn't look at. And so I've studied Latin America or Southeast Asia or India because those are societies where you can see what's going on in the world, yet at the same time, no one so India, Latin America are important. Southeast Asia, Islam, whatever, they're important places that determine how the world operates today, yet at the same time no one knows how they operate. And so I wanted a huge research project to figure out how India works, and this is the fruit of that project. And I've always said India is the hardest civilization to understand, and India is in some ways the most removed from the West. And you'll see that as their philosophy developed, because Indian and Western philosophy take the exact opposite positions on the world. And Westerners don't even have a concept that the things that happened in India can physically happen. And so that's what I love about talking about India, because once you understand India, you see the potential for what human societies could be is so vastly different from what normal people think can happen.
And say more about the difference there, or the relative to the expectations.
The biggest difference, there are two key differences that I think are really important, and we'll get into why these happened. And so the period we're covering in India is like 3000 BC to around the birth of Christ. So we're covering a very long period of time, and Indian civilization developed over that. And so the Indian civilization that I'm talking about here is the end point of that development rather than what it was earlier, because you'll see India. One of my favorite writers, Amaury de Riancourt, he talks about the evolution of Asian civilizations, and he said that when we see these Asian civilizations, we're seeing them at their final point, not not what they were as they evolved over time. And and so the two things that really separate India from the West, the first being Indians don't think reality is real. And that sounds absurd, but in Indian philosophy, they say everything we see around us is Lilaya or Maya, which means it's an illusion spun by the gods. And the only thing that really exists is spirituality. And so you have to connect yourself to God, or as the Indians call it, Brahman. And so you should ignore the physical world just for the spiritual, because everything you see around yourself is an illusion. And this has had a couple really fascinating developments in Indian history. One of which is that we don't really have any records for India before 1000 AD, because the Indians thought history was useless because the physical world is an illusion, which is just absurd if coming from a Western perspective. And the second thing is India never had strong political formations where you had the Roman Empire or the Chinese Empire or the Muslims, and and those were large, powerful political empires, and there was no real equivalent to that in India. There was the Mauryan Empire, which briefly controlled most of India, but they were never really serious. And so first saying reality doesn't exist. The second is the caste system, where across the rest of, I say there are four major Eurasian civilizations: Europe, the Middle East, India, and China. The other, and I say India is always the exception. India, there's 20 different things where India is the only society in the world that does that. And I say India's magical power is being the exception to every rule. But for India, they really entrenched themselves into the caste system. And the caste system is the caste system is one in which each social class is an ethnic group, where where, let's say, tanners or butchers or those people, they're only allowed to breed together. They can only associate with each other. And these castes go back thousands of years. So in the same Indian village, there are genetic bottlenecks that last 2,000 years. And so you're only marrying people of your specific social caste. And so that resulted in India developing in this bizarre direction, because you can't build up the political or the national levels of development because the social class level is so strong. And in all the other civilizations, whether China or India, China or Islam or the West, they purposely tried to lower class divisions to make the society more cooperative, because that allowed greater development through different social classes working together. But in India, they didn't care the political outcome of having a more successful society. They just wanted to, you can view a lot of Indian history as the priest class trying to hijack society for their strength. And that includes dividing up the population and among different social classes, and also saying reality doesn't exist.
That's a big drop.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
But let's get there first, because the priest class didn't always dominate India. So 5,000 years ago, India was under the Harappan or the Indus Valley civilization. And the Harappans are funny in that they are the largest numeric size of civilization in the Bronze Age world. So in the Bronze Age, 4,000 years ago, you have Mesopotamia, you have Egypt, you have the Philistines, you have the Phoenicians, you have India, you have China. The civilization the Harappans had in the Indus Valley was numerically the largest and had a giant area. All of modern Pakistan, Delhi, they had a colony out in Uzbekistan, and so that is a complete trajectory of history that we never think about, because the only reason we know about the Indus Valley civilization is because the British archaeologists in the 1930s dug up excavations of its cities. And it's rare that a society gets so crapped on and so destroyed that we don't even know that it ever existed, except for archaeology. And we know almost nothing at the Indus Valley civilization. We haven't deciphered their alphabet, and we picked up some details from art, but that's not really good info either. And some of the guesses we have is there was a unified society, because the Indus Valley covered this giant area and all the cities are built in exactly the same way. All of their wheels are the exact same size. All of their pottery looks exactly the same. And that degree of standardization 4,000 years ago is not normal. So we think that they might have some kind of evolution which resulted in them having this degree of centralization. And their cities didn't have walls either. So that suggests a large centralized government, because if it's the Bronze Age, you have to protect yourself. And we don't, as I said before, we don't really know anything of the Indus Valley civilization. But sometime a little bit after 2000 BC, they started to go into decline. And again, we don't know what happened here. But the best guess is the factors that put most empires into decline, such as disease, climate change, war, that sort of thing. And and we started to see the Indus Valley cities burn down from architecture. And and at that exact same time, the Aryans invaded India. And the Aryans, which I'm going to use the more controversial term, you can call them the Yamnaya, the Kurgan, the Indo-Europeans, the Indo-Aryans. They were a tribal people from modern Ukraine and South Russia who conquered an area from Ireland to modern Bangladesh because they invented the chariot so they could attack outwards. And so they invented the languages of almost all of Europe. English is an Indo-European language. Latin is, Greek is, Ukrainian, Iranian, and the languages of northern India. And India is split between a northern part, which is Indo-Aryan languages, and the south part is the Tamil languages. And the Indo-Aryans conquered the entirety north of India, and this is a period of history that has so much political propaganda around it. Literally, ancient India is the time period where I trust the historians who write on this topic the least, because India has the most absurdly nationalist school of history. Because the modern ruling party of India are the Hindu nationalists. And they just say insane stuff. It's unbelievable. They say that the caste system didn't really exist and the British invented it, which is absurd. They said that India would have industrialized without Britain. They said that the Indo-Aryan invasions never happened, even though we have archaeological, genetic, linguistic proof for it. They said that India is the source of almost all discoveries. They'll attach most discoveries back to India. And there are even some ridiculous Hindu nationalists who say they had stuff like nuclear bombs. The Hindu nationalists, there's like a spectrum from mild insanity to complete insanity. And the Hindu nationalists will often flood my comments. And they hate Islam. They think Islam destroyed India, which was a perfect society. But there's a lot of bad faith discussion. So Indians will say that there was no Indo-Aryan discoveries. They're native to India. But again, we have archaeological, genetic, linguistic, mythological, any kind of evidence you look for. But that notwithstanding, these Indo-Aryans conquered the north of India, and they became a new ruling class. And they were kind of a barbarian warrior people. And an author who writes at this topic, John Keyes, compared them to the Scottish Highlanders, where they fought in tribal warfare. They lived in clans. They built forts. The Aryans conquered their giant empire due to chariots. And so chariots were the main force in Indian warfare for most of the ancient period. And the chariots could just destroy the infantry. And so that created this kind of very knight-like aristocratic society where a small group of chariots could dominate the society. And the Indo-Aryans installed the caste system where they put themselves on top. And this happened 4,000 years ago. We don't really know why it happened, but it could be due to disease differentiation, where the local population had a lot more diseases than the conquerors who came from a colder climate. So they would have purposely separated themselves so that they wouldn't give each other diseases. It could be that the Aryans wanted to just stay on top and dominate the lower classes. There's a significant amount of evidence as well that the caste system existed in India before the Aryans as well. And so, again, all this stuff is happening a very long time ago. And it's comparable to the discovery of the New World, where when the British settled America, they put the blacks in the bottom and the whites on top, and the Native Americans were on reservations. In Latin America, they mixed with the natives. They brought blacks over, and they installed this caste system. This is something that's pretty common when you see different races mixing or coming into contact with each other. And so you saw the installation of this Indo-Aryan state and the caste system, not state, this series of different tribal groups, because India hadn't moved to a civilizational level where it was still tribes without writing that didn't live in cities. And there's not an easy transition to see how India develops. Around 1000 BC, India started to build more cities. They started to become more developed. They developed the Sanskrit writing system. And it's remarkable to look at India's development over this time because you see a bunch of different threads that come through, and it's unclear which thread would develop. And Amaury de Riencourt's book, The Soul of India, is a really good source on this because Amaury de Riencourt was an Orientalist who would read things in actual Sanskrit and then try to plot the development of Indian society over that era. And India was a feudal society, but the caste system wasn't super hard. And there was a caste system, but it wasn't completely rigid yet. And you start to see the development of proto-Hinduism, where Hinduism itself hadn't formed, but the thing that evolved into Hinduism would. And you saw the development of religious texts like the Upanishads, and you have the Mahabharata. And the thing with Indian religion is that it's incredibly complicated, and Hinduism has hundreds or thousands of gods. And I'm not going to go that much into Hindu philosophy in the worldview, but there is the great god Brahman, who he doesn't really care. He's just the natural order of the universe. And then he subdivides his personality into a bunch of different gods like Shiva or Kali or Rama and Vishnu, and then they have sub-avatars. They reincarnate into human bodies. And so the human, in the Indian worldview, the world is a dark place where we have to struggle, and souls constantly reincarnate into human bodies. And so it's a very different worldview from the Abrahamic religions of the West. And so at the start of the development in India, there were a warrior nobility. And so the caste system has 4 different levels. You have the, later on, the priest class or the Brahmins, they took power. The Brahmins took power, but originally the Kshatriya warrior caste beneath them, they were dominant. And then beneath them were the farmers, who are the Varna caste, and then you have the untouchable deletes at the bottom. And the untouchables, they're comparable in India to what blacks were in the Jim Crow South. They were used to like clean shit or to cut up carcasses. And it's really depressing to see how the untouchables have been treated in Indian history, where later on in Indian history, a Brahmin, the priest class, he wasn't allowed to make eye contact with an untouchable or step within 30 feet of him. And so you see this jostling between the warrior class and the priest class. And they wouldn't have seen it at this time, but later on we can see that there was class struggle between them. And over time, the priest class was able to install itself above the warrior class because they were able to appeal to the peasantry. Because in ancient farming societies, the priest classes have a really big advantage. And so Babylonia or Egypt or ancient China were all run by the priest classes because 90% of the population were farmers. And if you're a farmer, you're stressed all day. Is it going to rain this year? Am I going to have a good crop? And so when you're constantly when you're constantly worrying about the elements, you need to appease the gods so that you don't go crazy with anxiety. Well, meanwhile, because the Aryans were a herder people, they had herds of horses and cows and that stuff. And herder peoples are warrior societies because out in the grassland with all the cows and horses and sheep and stuff, you need to protect your animals from being conquered by another tribe. So you need to become a great warrior. And so most farming societies in the ancient world tilted theocracies, and most herding societies were warrior societies. And as the Indo-Aryan invaders assimilated into the local population, then India moved from more of a warrior-led society to a priest-led society. Do you have any questions?
And how long did that last? Or
Man, this took like 1,000 years.
Oh my god.
It feels weird to simplify a process like this. Maybe it took 500 years, but it's a very gradualistic process that you wouldn't notice if you lived through it. In India, India ossified to the cultural mode it had before the British, before the birth of Christ. Um, and both China and India ossified into their set cultural modes around 200 BC. Same thing with the Greeks and the Romans. They didn't really change after that until European colonialism. The Muslim world set into its cultural mold around 1000 AD, and the West did so in the 19th century, where we actually haven't had that many cultural changes in Western civilization since the 19th century. Or there have been changes, but they were the implementation of ideas that were developed earlier. So feminism, techno-optimism, materialism, all of these were ideas from 200 years ago that just got popular later. But to jump back to the point I was trying to make, as societies, and this is something Spengler writes about, societies often have a very aggressive, intrepid, entrepreneurial worldview when they're formed because you have to do that. But as the society gets older, you see ideas that become more about the maintenance of that society's security than its actual growth. And so you basically see the rise of people whose job is to be as conservative and stable as possible, so there's no growth. And in India, that was the priests. In China, it was the bureaucrats. In Rome, it was the slave owners. And in the West today, it's the bureaucracy. And that's what's happened to India. And so India has been invaded over 20 times. India has been invaded over 20 times in the last 3,000 years. And the Indians lost all of those 20 invasions except one or two, because it was all about this conservative, we can't change anything mindset the priests gave. But that notwithstanding, whenever we do these ancient history videos, I get too ahead of myself, because when you see 1,000 years, you can see the logical extension of these ideas. But India so we talked for a couple hundred years, India around 500 BC developed into a society with currency, with governments, with pre-established social codes, that sort of thing. And India then saw a change called the Axial Age. And the Axial Age is an interesting era of history we haven't covered that much, in which around 500 BC, at the exact same time, Socrates, Zoroaster, the founder of Zoroastrianism, Buddha, Lao Tzu, and Confucius all lived at the same time. So all of these founders of important ideologies or world religions lived at the exact same time. And the reasoning for that is pretty interesting, in which coins were introduced around that time. And what coins did is that money became about actually having money. And beforehand, it was social relationships, where if you were a baker, you had relationships with every single person in your village. And so you had IOUs, where if you gave someone your bread, you had an IOU in your head that they would give you some wood or give you some sheep in exchange for it later on. But with the invention of the coin, it broke down all of those social relationships in a way I think is comparable to the internet, where the internet broke down all of these interpersonal relationships. And thus, with the rise of coins, came complete social degeneracy. You had mass slavery, you had mass whoredom, you had gossiping and destroying reputations, you had genocide. Without these social relationships, society started to break down, of which happened at the same time. And so that's, again, why you saw Socrates, Lao Tzu, Confucius, Buddha, Zoroaster all at the same time. And in India before this was a period of, there was first a period of questioning the old gods. And so, interestingly, China, India, Europe, or the Greeks were all on the same trajectory. They first went through a phase of questioning the old gods and rationality, and then they fell into nihilism. And so over history, you see the same philosophies keep getting repeated again and again and again. So in the Greeks, the Chinese, and the Indians, you saw nihilist philosophies, you saw communist messianic philosophies, you saw materialism, extreme idealism, mysticism, anarchism. And so all of the ideologies we see in our era, we think that that our ideas are special. But the reality is that over history, people recycle the same ideas again and again whenever there's a breakdown of the traditional social code and the traditional religion. And this is where Buddha shows up, where Buddha entered a world where it was all these warring states in India, and there was social breakdown due to lack of shared values, and where all these philosophies were competing with each other. And Buddha was from modern Nepal, and Nepal is part of the Indian cultural area. And at this point, just the north of India were part of established states. And so Buddha's from modern Nepal, and he was the son of a local princeling, and there were loads of princes in India, so he wasn't like his father wasn't a super important guy. And the problem we run into here is that if you read a history of India, religion is one of the few things that's recorded well, because this is a society that thinks religion is everything. That being said, in Indian society, they don't have a concept of symbolic truth and real truth. And so the stories we have about Buddha's life are stories that were written to be symbols of correct conduct. And the Indians never cared if these stories are factually accurate. And so you have to take everything that's said here with a massive grain of salt. And the only good records we have of life in India in that time period is from foreigners who were visiting there. So we have Greek or Chinese or Persians who were in India, and they wrote about what was going on then. But the story goes, Buddha was a prince, and his father didn't want him to know how bad the world was. And so he hid him in the palace. And then Buddha saw all the suffering in the world. And he thought, how do I deal with the problem of suffering? And Buddha's ideas that he developed over the many years, where he left his kingdom, lived out as a mystic in the wilderness. And Buddha went through I kind of see it as similar today, where there's like a bunch of masculine improvement trends. You have Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, the red pill, and they had an equivalent to that in India. Like if you want to improve yourself, you go out into the woods and you live as a hermit, and you starve yourself, and you live naked, and you try to make yourself as poor and degraded as possible. And Buddha did that for a couple of years, and he nearly starved himself to death. And the Indian mystics of that era they show the extremity of what the human mind can accomplish. Because you'd hear stories about a guy who would sit on top of a pole for his entire life. He'd sit on the top of a pillar. Guys who would walk over burning coals. Guys who would live in caves for years straight, never seeing the sun. And the way this happens is that the human mind is actually quite malleable in what it can adjust to. And so with all this meditating and these spiritual processes, it actually is possible to evolve the human mind to a point where you can withstand this kind of suffering. We've looked at the brain structure of Hindu holy men, and their brains actually do work differently from normal people through having done all these spiritual processes for so long. And when the Greeks invaded India 200 years later, they met up with these Indian holy men, and they were shocked these guys existed or they were doing stuff. And the Greeks had their own cynic philosophers. The cynics were not like what the word cynical means today. The Greeks had their own school of their equivalent of guys who would meditate and live naked in barrels called the cynics. And so the Greeks had some comprehension of what the Indians were doing. But Buddha went through this path, and he realized, I don't really want this. I don't think this degree of trying to kill yourself is useful. And then Buddha developed this idea of a path you can take to reach enlightenment. Because the Indian worldview doesn't have a good or an evil or a heaven and a hell. The world is just a place of chaos, and you need to escape the place of chaos. And so Buddha said you should attain complete unattachment. And this is an idea that exists specifically in India. And for example, the Indians invented the number zero, which is quite profound because what is zero? Zero is the lack of the existence of anything. And that's not a concept that existed outside of India. Like, what does the non-existence of something mean? Like, something exists or it doesn't. What is being non-existent? And so zero was actually a philosophic concept that the Indians developed. And Indian philosophy was a reaching non-existence. I don't want to, and just not feeling the suffering of the world. And an important thing to realize here is that India and Greece had a couple important similarities because both of them were they had the same core ancestor being the Indo-Aryans. And what occurred here is that this same core population saw vastly different geographic conditions, where in Greece, it's this mountainous naval culture with a lot of islands and peninsulas. And so this spirit was channeled into philosophy and logic and war, where all these Greek city-states and republics developed. In India, giant, hot, flat plains. And so what happened was you saw this arrival of these giant empires gobbling other states up. And India did have republics, which is a weird trajectory. There were democracies in northeastern India, like the Greeks or the Romans, but those democracies died out. And so in Greece or Rome, this Aryan nobility, they became philosophers or generals or conquered the Persian Empire. In India, this nobility who lost their status due to having the giant empire conquer them, they became mystics. They went out into the jungle and meditated all day because you have this group of very smart, intrepid people with nothing to do. So they just became monks and partly as a way of coping with just losing everything. And the reason Indian philosophy, in my opinion, puts non-existence at such a high premium is because it was a society where a lot of people were very powerless, where this caste system determined every aspect of your life with giant oppressive governments. And so the way to deal with it was to basically numb yourself or separate yourself from the world.
You were mentioning earlier how people talk about how Islam was a negative effect. Can you say even more about what the actual effect and versus the perceived effect?
So I'm going to be open. One of the things I'm mocked about on the internet is I am one of the most pro-Islamic historians, where I actually like Islam. And the reason I say that is that my speciality is the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, the Muslim world was the wealthiest place in the world, the most technologically advanced, the most economically, they had giant empires. And until 300 years ago, the Muslims and the Europeans were at equal level of development or very close to equal level. And so when people look at Islam today, they're looking at one of the worst phases the Muslim world has gone through and not the high positive phases the Muslim world has gone through. And I just want to be transparent. The Muslims show up 1,000 years after the period we're talking about. So don't confuse them for that. And we'll probably get to a medieval India episode at some point. But the Hindu nationalists, and this entire era of history has been co-opted by Hindu nationalists. They hate the Muslims because the Hindu nationalists see it as their destiny to unify India. And they really hate that Muslim Pakistan is an independent country. So they project a lot of loathing onto the Muslims. And so for the Hindu nationalists who are part of this topic, the Muslims are a convenient enemy to unify around because they're the outgroup for modern India. And when the Muslims did invade India, they conquered 3/4 of it and they destroyed a bunch of cities. And I'm going to be totally blunt here. The Indians deserved it. And the reason I say that is that their society had grown so decadent and arrogant that the Indians, when the Muslims invaded India, the Muslims could defeat Indian armies 5 times their size. And the Indian rulers built temples to the gods rather than build armies to fight off the Muslims. And the Hindus had developed all of these policies, like if you spoke to a foreigner or a non-Hindu, you are permanently polluted. You can't live in within several hundred miles of the Muslims because you will be polluted. And they call the inhabitants of modern Pakistan polluted because they're too close to the Muslims. And so India just awesome. And travelers to India at that time said the Indians were the most arrogant people in the world. And so India was, they just became spectacularly decadent and arrogant. And then the Muslims beat the crap out of them. And I do admire India today. India today learned its lessons from the Muslims and the British, and then it had to evolve to become a better country. And they are doing that now. And the India that we are talking about now in the ancient world was a pretty dynamic society. But in the period where the Muslims slapped them, they were not in a good place. Any more questions before I get back to the main topic?
No, let's get back.
Okay.
Let's get overview of this.
Yeah. And so Buddha founded the religion of Buddhism about all these principles. And there were a lot of competing philosophies at the time of Buddha. And the Jains are a tiny religion. I think they're like 0. Whatever percent of India's population. And they believe that causing any suffering is bad and you shouldn't even hurt bugs and you should just be a vegetarian. And they're older than Buddhism. And the Jains never really caught on, although there were a couple periods where they were more successful in India. And India at this time, after the Buddha, because you had this period of strife and nihilism and that stuff. And India then went through a massive evolution. And there was a turning point where India could have become something different, but they didn't. And this was like the 300s and the 400s. And it's funny, these things can happen over history and people have no idea, even though this is probably one of the most important events in world history. And there were a couple steps to this. The first is that Alexander the Great conquered the northwest of India. And a lot of you guys would know, or I hope you know who Alexander the Great is, at least on a peripheral basis. He was this Greek conqueror who conquered the entire Middle East, invaded India, fought some local Indian armies. He fought very well. And then his men had been fighting for over a decade and then just got tired and told him to go back. But there is this weird trajectory where the Greeks controlled the northwest of India. And the Greeks established a kingdom in Afghanistan called the Bactrian Kingdom. That the Greek Bactrians, in around 180 BC, they invaded India out to Bangladesh. They invaded across the entire north of India. And no one's heard of them, it's just crazy to see these things happen. And the Greeks and the Indians did cross-pollinate, where there's an idea that Plato and cynicism and stoicism, Plato said he went to India, and there was definitely context. So a lot of Greek philosophies had influence from India, and the architecture and the sculpture style in the northwest of India has a lot of influence from Greek architecture and sculpture. And so there was a big cross-pollination between the Greeks and the Indians. And the irony is no Indian sources mention Alexander the Great. And that's an example of how bad Indian record keeping was. It's comparable to the pyramids are never once mentioned in the Bible. And so you can see that these giant documents will often have these glaring holes in them. And I'll think, imagine if in 4,000 years from now, the only source we have on modern America is John Oliver. What is John Oliver leaving out? And we'd end up with a very skewed view of the modern world from just having records of John Oliver clips. But then as the Greeks grew weaker in northwestern India, it created a power vacuum. And again, Indian records aren't good, so we don't know how much of this is true or how much of it is myth. But in the power vacuum in the Punjab in the northwest of India, an alliance was formed between Chandragupta and Kautila. And Kautila was a professor of statecraft at the University of Taxila. India had universities, and Chandragupta was the dispossessed son of a chieftain. And they teamed up, this chieftain, and this professor of strategy, and they took over the entire north of India. These two guys, they rallied together followers in the forest together, because most of northwest India was forest at this point. And then they launched a series of wars that made the Mauryan Empire, which is one of the biggest empires. Was the biggest empire in Indian history ever. And it took a couple different generations, so it wasn't just them. But I find their story to be one of the most inspirational in history. And I don't know how much of it's true, but there definitely was a Mauryan Empire. People, some random guys did form it somehow. But when I wake up in the morning, I think, how can I be more like Chandragupta and Kautila? And so the Mauryans are the Indian equivalent to the Roman Empire, the big Islamic Caliphate, or the Chinese. It's their big empire. But the thing with the Mauryans is that it was a very loosely run empire, and it had almost all of India geographically, except the very bottom. It had it went out to Afghanistan and Pakistan, where they fought wars with the Greek Empire that controlled Iran. And the thing, though, and this shows a lot of elements of India, is the Mauryans didn't have a bureaucracy. The reason they could have an empire that big was that they were just taking small amounts of tribute from all those kings around India. And so that wasn't a really stable form of governance. And they barely had that territory. But in addition to that, they didn't write anything down, which is what I mean by that is, the US government has all these agencies which use paperwork to manage America with taxes and the military. The Mauryan Empire didn't write anything down. In their empire, everything was done orally. Let that sink in. Every single part of the empire was done through spoken word. And
so there's a lot of things that must have gotten lost. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And so the Mauryans fell apart over 100 years for all those reasons. And then India went into a period which we call the Indian Dark Age. And that's because we have even less records from that time period. And the cities fell apart. And in India in this time period, cities didn't exist for economic, or a lot of cities, or most didn't exist for economic or social reasons. It was because a king set up the city. He would get craftsmen and people to come to the king's court. And so these cities were basically just government agencies. And so when the government fell apart, the cities would fall apart. And so India went through its own equivalent of its dark age from like 200 BC until 200 AD. But the reality is that it was a very wealthy time period. Learning didn't fall apart. So the Indian Dark Age wasn't as bad as the Dark Age after the fall of Rome. But in India's Dark Age came a couple different shifts that were really important for India's development. One of which is that there was the constant competition in Buddhism and what would evolve into Hinduism, where the Mauryan Empire was Buddhist, and the Buddhists were seen as the group that was supported by the middle class and the merchants. Well, the Hindus, they were the nobility and the peasants. And so this was a class and religious war over what would become India. And the Hindus were able to win. And the Hindus were the only one of the old gods that won. Around the rest of the world, Christianity took over Europe. Islam took over the Middle East. Confucianism and Buddhism took over China. But the equivalent would be in Europe. Imagine if the Greeks and the Romans, they took a lot of intellectual concepts from Christianity and then they beat Christianity. And so Hinduism, it's ironic because Hinduism says that Buddhism is a subset of Hinduism. The Buddhists say they're different from the Hindus. And so what happened was that there were the old gods. The Buddhists were a reformation against the old gods. And then the old gods took ideas from the Buddhists to beat the Buddhists. And so Buddhism doesn't really exist in India anymore. It spread to Southeast Asia and China and East Asia. But Buddhism largely died out in India because the Hindus won. And the Hindus won by appealing to the nobility, where they said, hey, you guys are at the top in the caste system. If you follow the Hindu gods, we'll say the caste system is holy and you can't break it. And they said to the peasants, hey, the Buddhists don't care about your physical life. We'll try to help you because if you talk to a poor person, and in a lot of cases you tell them the world's not real, your problems aren't real, don't worry. The poor person is going to tell you to go to hell. And so that's how the Hindus won, and they drove the Buddhists out of India. But the Hindus then launched a conservative revolution through this, in which India at this point became incredibly conservative, and it stopped changing until British colonialism. The caste system ossified into a very strict social structure, where if you see what happened to caste, it's just absolutely ridiculous. Where again, you can only marry people of your caste, you can only speak and associate with people of your caste, and so your entire life is determined by caste, and the caste rules tell you they tell you how to bathe, how to eat. You can't use the same frying pans as people of other castes. You can't look at them in a lot of cases. You can't be within physical proximity to them. And this, when people ask me, what do you think the most negative aspect of Indian society is? I will just say caste immediately for all these reasons. And it stopped India from being creative. India became the society which treated women the worst in history, where they developed rules like if a widow's husband dies, it's moral for her to burn herself to death rather than remarry. Or women would stay in the home their whole lives and never, and they had no rights and all that sort of thing. And so that developed, and because the merchant classes were backed by Buddhism, the new conservative consensus was against the merchant classes. And so India set into this very set conservative mold around the time of the birth of Christ that didn't break out of for a very long time. And you wonder what would have happened if India went in a different direction, because there was a point around 300 BC where they could have ended the caste system, where there were these revolutions inside India against the ruling caste, with low caste dictators taking power. And Buddhism tried to break down the caste system. And that's my best summary of ancient Indian history. I have a couple more facts I want to get to, but do you have any questions with the broad narrative?
Yeah, one is, what do you think are the biggest either pivotal turning points, or I guess when you think about alternative history for India, like what comes to mind, or the things that could be different?
So with the foundation of religions, the interesting thing is that people talk about all these macro forces and all these things like demographics or geography or whatever. When you look at a prophet, you're looking at a single person where their thoughts determine history. If Christ had a bad day and wrote down a weird chapter of the gospel that made no sense, people would obsess over that chapter for the rest of their lives, trying to find thousands of years, trying to find the esoteric symbolism behind it. And so I think Buddha is a huge turning point, because he developed an entirely new religion. And the problem with this era of history is we don't have any records for it. So I don't know. So when I look at this Hindu reaction that won, we don't really know who led it. And if we had records, we could piece it together, but it's just a faceless movement as of now. I think that it's kind of, and I'm sure some Indians in the audience, a lot of them really won't like this video for obvious reasons, but I hope that those who do watch it and are willing to be open to it, that they will be able to tell me what exact historic figures I'm missing, who was part of that broader change. Chandragupta, the founder of the Mauryan Empire, he is one of the greatest figures of this time period. So he was the greatest conqueror. Yeah.
What were the facts you wanted to make sure to get across?
So I have a couple kind of schizo theories because I read a lot of stuff and there are weird directions I go into. And one of them is, one of my favorite books is The Eye of Shiva by Amaury de Riaucourt, where, again, Amaury de Riaucourt was an Orientalist, and every previous society in history believes in the spirit world and the divine and that stuff. And he developed a theory that the Hindus discovered lots of secret truths about the world through meditation and spirituality, in which the Hindus, keep in mind, the Hindus are the same root people as the Greeks. And so the Greeks developed philosophy and what became science. The Hindus developed the science of religion, in which they would consume psychedelics called soma, they would meditate, they would astral project, and then there were thousands of these basically priest scientists around India who would corroborate results to create a map of the spirit world. And so I say that Hinduism is the best developed religion in the world because so much thought and effort has gone into producing it. And Amory said, the nature of India is partly that you will see the greatest of genius next to the most brutal inhumanities, where Indian philosophy, and India is a society with religious freedom. So it's a society in which you you can believe whatever you want, and it's hard to have an incorrect opinion in Hinduism because Hinduism succeeded because it's so broad. And it can appeal to so many different groups where you have all the gods, you have all the separate cults, you have all the sects of Hinduism. So you'd have that brilliance next to something like the caste system. Or like people, like in India, cow dung is holy. And so people will bathe in cow dung or they will eat cow dung, just stuff like that. And that same person will then spout some of the most brilliant lines you'll ever hear. But what Amory de Rayancourt said is that the Hindus were able to discover a lot of the same conclusions as modern science through their spiritual discoveries. And so the things Hinduism teaches about the world are pretty similar to quantum physics and string theory. And so there are certain, and this is something the discoverers of modern physics were aware of, where Einstein said this. It's why Oppenheimer quoted the Bhagavad Gita when he built the nuclear bomb, because they were looking at this stuff and they're thinking, this is pretty close to what you read about in Hinduism. Like Hinduism says the world is billions of years old and we're all little bubbles in the cosmos, and that space and time, you can rip it apart, and that how you see the world has more to do with how your brain processes information and the underlying reality. Or the Hindus say that everything is constant motion, and that everything is changing all the time and particles are just ripping apart. But then we create the illusion that these particles are constant and the same. Well, the reality is that they're all part of this underlying atomic system that is changing. So for my desk, you could rip it apart, throw it in the ground. The desk will then erode into the ground, become the ground, it'll become grass, rise up through the air. So the Hindus had a lot of ideas like that. And Amory de Rayancourt also said the Hindus had the most advanced concept of psychology. And he said that it was more advanced than our society, where the Hindus said that the role of psychology is to gradually integrate yourself with the world. So that when you're stressed, you realize that you are part of something bigger and that you belong to. And so what we've found in modern psychology, because therapy has been completely ineffective at helping people's mental health. As the amount of therapists go up, the amount of mental health issues go up. And we found through a bunch of studies that religion and community are the top two things that make people happiest. And that's something the Hindus have said. And so I say a lot of negative things about India in this video, but I do think India is one of the most brilliant civilizations in history. But I don't think we really have the frame of reference to understand how brilliant they are in our society.
How should we think, say more about how should we think about the impacts of sort of Britain on India in terms of, leaving India better off, worse off, the alternative? Yeah. Say more about this.
You said Britain, right?
Yep.
Okay. So people are going to hate me for this. I think Britain was a large net positive. The reason I say that is that the British knocked the Indians out of their stasis, because the Indians' science is so different from the Indian worldview that the Indians, to comprehend science, had to completely open up their minds. And India is a democracy because of Britain. It has a train system. It has a modern economic system. The British were the first people to unify India. They gave them their military structure. Modern India is a creation by the British, and the Indians really don't like to think that. And the worst thing the British did is they had famines, and we'll probably do a British India episode at some point. But the British they didn't share food during famines. Like they didn't open up the government food banks during famines, and they did this in Ireland too, where the famine in Ireland 200 years ago, it resulted in my ancestors coming to America, and it lowered Ireland's population by 2/3. So that's the worst thing the British did. But in my opinion, the British brought India into the modern world, which they wouldn't have done otherwise. And like if you look at all the colonial empires, the British were the nicest colonial empire. And if you look at former British colonies versus French or Spanish or German colonies, the British colonies did better. And I can't imagine that if India was a French colony or a German colony or a Spanish colony, that it would be markedly better off. And and this is really brutal, for the average Indian, I don't think the British were worse, because keep in mind, like 95% of the population in India stopped being a democracy like 2000, stopped having any democracies 2000 years ago. And for the lower classes, they didn't really care who was in charge. I don't think the British were markedly worse rulers than their local ruling classes either. And I have read multiple opinions. I have read Sashi Tharoor's book against British colonialism, which I think is a lot of fair points. So for Indians who are just going to hate this in the comments, please be aware that I do know your side of the argument. I'm not just a racist Anglo-colonial.
Well, we're sharing our most controversial opinions on India.
Yeah, exactly.
Anything else we should be sharing?
No, I think that's good. We covered India.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess here's one last, gearing towards closing.
Yeah.
And if you have any other books, do let us know. But
I have them.
What do you think understanding about India's history and its evolution to the present helps us understand about India today?
Yeah, I mean, most white people have no concept how India works in any level. And India is one of America's most important allies. And so we need to know how India works. And like, you live in Silicon Valley. How many Indians do you run into every day? Probably a lot.
A lot. They're CEOs of our companies.
Yeah, exactly.
Google, Microsoft, so they're crushing it.
Isn't it important to know how they view the world or what culture they're from? And one of the issues I have with anthropology, because anthropology is a topic I'm really in, I think I might be more of an anthropologist than a historian, is that when anthropologists make visions of the world, their thought is, how does this is an anthropological model for a white upper middle class professor who lives in Boston. I am a white Anglo from rural Pennsylvania, and I still feel like anthropologists don't understand my people's culture. Let alone India. And so all these anthropologists are making this worldview. Oh my God, this is a worldview that makes sense to people who are professors in California, in Los Angeles. And even white Americans, white rural Americans are a weird culture. If you really want to know what humanity is about, look at India, because India is much more indicative of what the human condition is, because these people, these things like, oh my God, religion is lame, tribalism's lame, history doesn't matter, tradition's lame. And then you look at friggin' India, where that built its entire society around religion, tradition, community, taboos, that sort of thing. And like, looking at India will tell you more about humanity as a rule than looking at America will. Because if you build a theory of the world, it better explain India, or it's just jacking off Westerners.
With that image in mind, shall we close with the book recommendation?
So this is The Soul of India by Amaury de Riencourt. This is definitely the best book in this topic. You should, for old books, you should go on Alibris. Alibris is a site that sells you antique used books for like $5. This is a book on the genetics of early India. It's pretty good. The best resources on this topic are actually pre-established segments of larger historical anthologies, because there hasn't been that much written recently on India. Now, a lot of the recent stuff is just Hindu propaganda. The Rise of the West, this is one of the best histories of the world. This is one of the best explanations of ancient India. And Our Oriental Heritage by Will Durant. This also is a 200-page segment that's one of the best things you'll read about India.
I'm amazed that you have read so much about so many places, and you're only you're just starting in some ways.
Yeah, thank you.
Should we give a preview as to what's next week?
Either The Rise of Islam or Ancient China. You can pick whichever.
Excellent. Sounds good. Well, if commenters have things they want to hear about,
Yeah.
do let us know. And also, if you're about to leave a hate comment, take a deep breath. You know, I know that this one, will rile some people up. But Richard, always a pleasure. And until next time.
Thank you. Pleasure as always. Peace. Bye.